Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Campbell. I'm representing the executive committee of the Urban Design Panel today, and I'm going to introduce our presentation on community-led design and visioning for resilient communities by Heather Flint Chatto, principal of Forage Design and Planning. The Urban Design Panel is sponsored jointly by the American Institute of Planners, the American Planning Association, the American Institute of Architects, got a little ahead of myself, the American Planning Association, and the American Society of Landscape Architects, and is composed of professionals from those three organizations with a shared interest in urban design. We're joined today by Kurt Wilson, Executive Vice President of the AIA Oregon. The AIA has previously hosted this event at the Center for Architecture in Portland and now generously offers this monthly Zoom meeting until further notice. In addition to a monthly email announcement, our panel presentations can be found on the AIA Oregon event calendar, as well as their weekly Thursdays at 3 newsletter, and frequently on the Oregon APA event calendar as well. Participation in any event makes you a panel member. We encourage you to sign up for information about future presentations, and when you register for any UDP presentation, you will be included on upcoming invitations. We also encourage you to send any interesting future panel presentation ideas to Adrienne Morris at AIA Oregon. And I think she can share her email address there. These presentations are recorded and are made available by the AIA as a Vimeo file, which can be found in the link provided in the chat box. This presentation will be approximately 30 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session. For the Q&A, please pose your questions and comments in the Zoom chat box. Our executive committee member, Bob Boileau, will be managing the chat function for this meeting and will pose the questions following the presentation. Follow-up questions can be sent directly to today's presenter if Heather's okay with that. The email address is in the chat box if acceptable, that is. So Heather, if you're okay with that? Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Heather and we're on our way here. So go ahead, Heather. You need to unmute yourself first, though.
There we go. And gonna.
And she's attempting to share her screen here, I believe. There you go.
Heather, are you muted?
Yeah.
There we go. Hi there. Thanks so much for having me today. It's an honor to be with you all. And this is my third time actually presenting at the Urban Design Panel. The first time I was presenting on zero energy buildings, and last time on, gosh, I don't even remember exactly the topic, but we were presenting on some of our work with PDX Main Streets on community-led planning. So it's great to be back to talk to you about a variety of different topics related to the need for a kind of coming together for greater resiliency and how we can kind of shape a new vision for our city. So one of the questions that has really come up in community planning is, are we guiding our citywide vision with sufficient care and involvement of the people most affected? As we contribute to the story of this place, are we thoughtful about what should remain and what should change? What are the patterns of this place, and how can this help us be responsive to context and help us make density that fits, that has the support from communities, that it feels like it's theirs, that they want to care for it, and that it is responsive to helping fill in the gaps where most needed. How can communities have a greater voice in shaping the redevelopment of their neighborhoods and have an equitable seat at the table, not just at the end to give input, but actually all throughout the process? And how can we support our decision makers to really be able to leverage the work of communities when budgets and staff time is limited? And how do we work together with our amazing design community as partners and advocates for a community vision that is shared. So I have a small design and consulting firm. I'm an urban planner of 20 years, and I'm also an environmental designer. And I've worked in local government and with small nonprofits, as well as, in research capacities and as a policy advocate and policy writer. So I'm a former government staff person with the local government, and I now have my own firm and really focused on creating sustainable design practices that leverage the resources that we have with the least cost and the greatest impact. This is actually my little cottage that used to be my office until my architect husband took it over. So, we really wanted to emphasize in our own home space how we could adapt what we had. And this is our little cottage, and our house was moved on horse-drawn logs in the 1940s when the city rezoned everything west of 12th to industrial. And so we've got a nice little adapted structure of a house, and have sort of taken back what we can to foster our own walk the talk, essentially. And so what really we'd like to focus on is how do we draw upon the people and the culture and the context of each place while bringing forth as much ecological solution and innovation. So some of the work that I had done in the past was, previous to forming my own design firm, was with New Buildings Institute, a national think tank for high performance buildings. And I was the primary consultant to the California Public Utilities Commission, who has been very innovative in setting what they call their BBs, their big, bold goals for energy efficiency. And my job was to educate architects, engineers, local governments, and schools about zero energy buildings, developing curriculum, and taking people on tours, developing training materials. And I had a wonderful opportunity to connect with an incredible group of what they call early adopters and leaders in California on this. And California has more zero energy buildings than any other state. And so I hope that we will foster greater zero energy buildings in Portland as well. And one thing I will just share as a favorite story is that we would have local governments come and say, well, we can't do this. How could we build a building that is, generates all its own energy over the course of a year? And then we would take them on a tour, and they would instantly have a change in their awareness and appreciation of what is possible. And so as we talk about visioning today, I want to just remind you to just keep that in mind, that my approach is always, when people say we can't, is to say, how could we? So keep asking ourselves, how could we? We are doing things right now that we never thought were possible, taking over our streets and turning them into public gathering spaces. So sometimes we need a demonstration of what's possible, but also having that vision. So other things that I've done in terms of adaptive work has been, some of you might know the Sequential Biofuel Station in Eugene, which is a brownfield site. And we installed large photovoltaic canopies above the fueling islands, an 8,000 plant green roof, a naturally daylit store, bioswales, and educational signage. And that was when I was a planner with Habitats in Eugene. Some of the work that I'm doing now has been supporting the Johnson Creek Watershed Council in developing some community engagement and education materials, developing their stormwater management assistance program, done a lot of work on green infrastructure. And there's certainly areas of our city that could use some more green infrastructure. And bringing together who are the people that are important to foster these kinds of roles. Another project we're working on is a tiny house artist eco-village, looking at how we can create a replicable model of affordable adaptive housing. And this is taking an existing single family house on a multifamily site and adapting that to add density with an additional 9 tiny houses. And we are advocating on the shelter to housing policy that's going to City Council tomorrow, in fact, for an innovative housing demonstrations policy. Because previous to this policy, this type of development was pretty much impossible to do under current code. But I'm happy to say the city is changing their code to allow more tiny houses. And we'd like to see more innovation that is hard to do right now that we might be able to advance. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that after. I hope someone will monitor the chat for me because I can't really see it to manage both. Another project I'm working on is a revitalization plan for the city of Hoquiam, which is a coastal town in Washington, which really has seen the value of their historic buildings and their historic downtown to really draw tourism and economic vitality. And it's a really strong part of their identity. So that's been a wonderful opportunity to work on that. Another project that we've been working on as sort of a passion project is PDX Main Street's design guidelines, which we initiated. Linda Netakoven, one of my closest collaborators, is here today. So grateful to her and the many, many architects, planners, designers, landscape architects, community leaders, neighborhoods, businesses, associations that have partnered over a 5-year process to create Main Street design guidelines. One of the city staff people told me they had never seen anyone do more public engagement than we had done, which was very flattering. Having written Main Street design guidelines as a professional planner when I was a planner in Santa Barbara County for the largest unincorporated urban area in the state of California, I was familiar with the process of bringing people together across different disciplines and managing community advisory groups to develop Main Street guidelines. And since I live near Division, we didn't really have the tools to manage the growth that was happening and wanted to help our neighborhood. So we thought we would start a small process across neighborhoods. And little did we know that many communities wanted similar tools. So our guidelines have now been adopted by 8 neighborhood and business associations for 12 streets in Southeast Portland. However, we have learned from the city that there is no pathway for community-led planning to be recognized at the city. And when I mentioned that to Commissioner Hardesty, she said, that's not right, that's not okay, which also means things like Albina Vision have no pathway for community-led planning to be recognized. So I want to flag that as an opportunity. So instead of how we can't do it, how could we do it? How could we leverage those resources? And so one of the things that we will be advocating for, and I would love any support, our volunteers, is a community-based planning policy. I have not seen one of those, but I think it would be another opportunity for Portland to be a leader in innovation. So some of the work that we do with PDX Main Streets, I mentioned. This is my other hat. And we have been honored to receive multiple Women of Vision Awards. Linda Netakoven also is one. And I've won 2, 2015 and 2019. And in my speech, I mentioned, my husband likes to call me, he likes to say that I have double vision. But I actually think that maybe that's not a bad thing, because I think you need to be looking in multiple directions at once as we're planning. Where have we been? And where are we now? Where are we going? Where do we want to be? What is our current context? And what is our desired future context? And who decides? Who has the power to decide what our places are? Is it equitable? And are we engaging sufficiently that communities have a real voice and a real seat at the table? One of the things that has been challenging is not having the language to help communities understand what good density looks like, how to do good infill, how to make buildings that really add to the culture and vibrancy of a place. How does it feel additive versus reductive? And one of the things that we've noticed as a challenge is that communities don't really have the tools to ask for what they want. So they often will resist and say, oh, I just don't like that big dense building. But instead, we've been able to help communities have greater tools through design guidelines to be able to say, I'd like it to pick up on that window pattern that would align a little bit better. It would feel like it was responsive to its place. Is it responsive to the district? Is it responsive to that pattern that you see across the city? How can communities have the literacy to more effectively engage with designers and developers so that they are partners in the process, and that they feel like they can actually focus more energy on the things that they can control rather than what they can't. They cannot control the density. They can't control the floor area ratios. These are not things that are really within their power, and it's a waste of everyone's energy. And so what we found is greater design literacy can speed the process, can clarify design goals early on for designers, and create a smoother and faster process. So one of the other things we do is we try to always stay proactive and positive and honor where we see leadership, whether it's really good new Main Street design, good missing middle, adaptive reuse, art and innovation. All of these buildings relate to the pattern language of Main Streets, whether they're modern or more traditional. So why do we need community-led planning? Well, one of the things is that we have a really horrible history of historic and ongoing racial and spatial injustice. Communities are very underengaged right now. We have so much that we're dealing with in the pandemic, so much loss that we're struggling with. And there's an overwhelming volume of policymaking that's been happening, and we've sort of burned out our advocates to be able to help communities when they don't have the resources to really be participating as effectively as we'd like. We have we've been in a moment of major growth and change, yet many of our communities haven't had area plans to help them define and really guide their future growth. That work was never done for many areas. So we've grown, but we were lacking the tools. And then we have limited staff and budget time available to respond when we have major redevelopment. The policymaking is really at a level that is difficult for people to participate in. It's not digestible and presented in a way that makes it more accessible. And are we only reaching people through meetings? How do we reach people where they really are? And so we've seen this great divide politically. Communities are torn apart. You may have read about some of the Office of Civic and Community Life and the kind of culture that's happened around sort of NIMBY, YIMBY politics. And really what we've seen is actually that communities just don't have the tools to understand the nuances about density and design. That often they will like a tall building, but what they're often responding to is an incompatibility in design. And so how do we do that allows for a variety of different types of architecture to happen and flourish? And how do we give communities that want a seat at the table a meaningful voice in shaping their places? We are at we've been at a rising pressure point. I love this barometer picture. We have been in a major time of change, and we need to make sure that we are also creating that framework that nothing about us without us is the Portland way. How do we keep doing that well? So one of the things you'll see on our website, pdxmainstreets.org, is tools for community planning. This is only a little snippet of it, but we try to reach people in lots of different ways, whether it's out on the street with presentations and maps, and whether it's photography exhibits highlighting the pattern language. Sometimes we'll be out at a grocery store or at a farmer's market, engaging people, putting together stakeholder workshops, art installations and collecting data, whether it's design walking tours or visioning workshops. We've been doing a lot of stakeholder engagement over 7 years. And this is actually from a workshop on adaptive, affordable green development that we put together, bringing together, you see a planning commissioner, head of housing, city staff people, Kavanaugh developers, local property owners, architects, really trying to bring together different affordable housing builders to talk about how do we work together? What are the problems? What are the challenges? And so we've developed a whole suite of tools and resources that we are providing to communities to engage with them in ways that make design more accessible. And this is not an anti-density approach. This is a pro-density approach, actually helping turn people on to good density by raising their design literacy. And so what is the problem? Where are we at? What is let's dig in a little bit. So we've expanded our urban sphere, but we don't have the tools. We see increased gentrification, loss of affordability, but often new development has poor relationship to foundational neighborhood context. There's a less crafted quality. We sort of pride ourselves on our craftedness, our art, and many of our smaller main streets are filled with this sort of creative, artistic qualities and art in the buildings, and we are underserved for art. So sometimes that provides that artistic element that we love and crave. There are significant impacts of new development. We don't really have the tools. We don't have a sort of a scorecard to track what are we gaining, what are we losing, and are we place making? Are we place keeping, place taking? What are those balances that we need to make? Are we pausing to evaluate those values? Does fostering one public good mean we must value another public good? How do we retain what's special and synergize those strengths while allowing for that change to happen? How do we create more supportive spaces? How do we create more walkable 20-minute neighborhoods for all? Leveraging development to fill in the gaps where we need jobs and services and amenities. So I also like to pay attention to psychology of place. Much we don't perceive, what we perceive but don't know how to describe. We feel a certain way, but we don't know why. And does it feel cold? Does it feel sharp? Does it feel warm and inviting? So as designers, we have this amazing power and a great responsibility. How do we shape those places that then shape us? That famous Winston Churchill quote of, we shape our buildings, which in turn shape us. So how do we have that sense of context, that sense of place, as we think about both the buildings and the streets and the gathering spaces in between? We've built a lot of important new housing, but we haven't necessarily built the public spaces that make the density work, the amenities that make the density work, the gathering places. Sam Adams had a plaza in every neighborhood proposal, and I would love to see that come back. That would be something for everyone, those places where we all get to mix and connect. And we have these different scales of context that I think we can do better to really attend to. And as designers, how can we be balancing that sort of humbleness that we are inserting ourselves into an existing foundational context, while also allowing ourselves to flourish and be creative and innovate? And so how do we attend to those many different scales of context? What formed our places? How has it been shaped into what it is today? What cultures left their mark through their craft? Who was here and who remains to tell that story? And as we consider our role here, how can we be thoughtful in drawing from those important cues? Because what do we want to see in the next 100 years? What will be left that tells our story? So I love this quote. This is not from anyone particularly wise, except that she is my yoga teacher. And I really appreciated this because actually, moving into a down dog position, she said, if you look back before you leap, you'll go farther. And I think that's true in our urban planning too. What is our context? What's our foundational framework? Much of Southeast still looks this way today. And I personally will travel places to go and look at architecture, to study those patterns. How did they build good density that we love today? How does it sustain? And so if we look back, I think we can also embrace those qualities while also innovating and creating new architecture. And one of the things that has been foundational in our shaping of Portland has been our streetcar era, our streetcars, and those places that formed around those streetcars are significant. Many of them are rail stops, that where we have these little hubs. And so we've created Main Street guidelines that respond to many of those Main Street areas. Because when we started working on them for division, we realized many more communities had similar patterns. You see those patterns on Hawthorne and Belmont and Fremont and Alberta and Woodstock and in Selwood Moorland and Montevilla. And so we started studying that pattern language, and we started pulling out pieces that we realized it wasn't just about division. And so then Hawthorne adopted our design guidelines, and then Woodstock adopted them, and Selwood Moorland, and more communities. Hosford Abernay has just adopted our Main Street guidelines for all 7 of their main streets. So we studied the patterns of these places, the details, that's the craft that make the buildings feel human scale, even if they're tall. And those chamfered corners, it's not about style, it's about, functional form. How do you not run into someone as you're coming around the corner? How do you create a prominent entrance? How do you relate to human scale design? And this human size is reflected in these tall vertical windows. It's not about style, but it's about, as you grow taller and taller and taller, how do you keep that human scale element? And these are a few examples of other types of buildings that also relate to the pattern language, those storefronts, those vertical windows, those articulated roof lines, treatment of the building on all sides, and that art and that craftedness. So as we think about qualities of resilient communities, how do we have those adapted, accessible places that are well-resourced and economically vital, that are walkable and mixed use, those 20-minute neighborhoods, mixed income, socially healthy and strong in culture? What is going to sustain us, and what makes our public spaces welcoming for all and accessible? How do we have that vibrant commons and places to engage or retreat? And how are we fostering that environmentally sound, climate and energy responsive approach to shaping our city? Do we have the ability to influence self-determination and a voice in shaping our community? I love these public exercise machines are all over public parks. I'm seeing them in New York and all over Europe. And what services can we provide? And how do we foster design justice as we go? And this justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, there's a much greater attention on that. And I keep hearing people asking for self-determination, a real role in being able to participate, and not just from the top down, but grassroots up. We talk a good game, but I don't see it embedded in our policymaking. And so how do we move from informing in our policy process to engaging and empowering? So one of the things that we've been working on is also placemaking. And so this is a design project of my own, inspired by many of the kiosks I saw all around Europe. And so we've created an approach that we think could be really lovely for COVID responsiveness, but for many different applications. And we have some resources to put solar on these, and then also embed a stockpile of redeployable emergency batteries, so that those could be redeployed by neighborhood emergency workers and other city staff in case of an emergency, but also provide information on wayfinding and information about the different cultural communities and architecture and history. And so some of these, even like this in Lisbon, have a bathroom. which is a deep need that we hear for helping small business districts, for downtown, incubator spaces for small businesses. We have our endangered species, our food carts. We are losing those as sort of land banking as we grow, we're sort of losing those. But how do we bring back something that is more of our sort of urban infrastructure that also provides a variety of amenities and services? And how might this also work to support perhaps houseless villages with some more well-designed infrastructure? And these are frequently cast iron, so they're built to last, they're sort of bomb-proof, and they can provide that sort of flexibility and off-grid opportunities for kind of a resiliency hub. So we like looking at these as sort of a variety of services of wayfinding and gateways, of community placemaking, emergency response, and houseless services. And then we've got all these main streets. So we've been advocating that we don't really have the tools that we need for many of these places. These are our mini downtowns, and in many other in many cases, these were a downtown before they were annexed into the city of Portland. And yet we don't really have the tools. As I mentioned, we haven't done many of our area plans historically, and so we haven't had the tools to be able to shape these centers with care. And so, as you can see from this little diagram, the change is great. And so if we don't really respond to the patterns of these places, modern, traditional, however they are, the patterns are what are really formative to making good infill that communities can get behind, that they can really support the density because they see that it's respectful and can be artful, it can be much taller even, but just paying attention to those. And we don't have Main Street standards and guidelines, and those are not in the citywide design standards that are going to City Council on May 12th. And so we have been advocating for that, but we have tools and we'd love to share them. We also don't have an appropriate, as we've heard from many community members, an appropriate level of review. Downtown has a 45-foot height design review trigger, and it's proposed at 65 feet. Gateway is 35. So we think that these buildings are in many cases double the size of what's there, and so we may be able to relate better. Here's one building that is taller, different, but speaking the same language, and another building that's speaking a different language. It's doing some things well on the ground floor. It's working it harder to step back and trying to break it up, but it's doing some things that are very different. And so we're trying to see how can these buildings be a good neighbor, and how can we also innovate. So we have a proposal for an innovative housing demonstrations policy. How do we foster the things that are harder to do right now, where there may be code barriers, but they could contribute to greater affordable housing? And that demonstration, I mentioned how we were able to change the perspective of a government planner, basically just by seeing that demonstration. And so we'd like to see more of these strategies. And I encourage people to consider supporting and testifying on the shelter to housing continuum policy coming tomorrow at City Council. So things like the Art Farm Tiny House Village, living buildings, zero waste buildings, zero energy buildings, co-housing, community land trust. Some of these are built types, and some of these are more operational types. There's also something called equitable food-oriented development. And so housing that is paired with that. We've seen that transit-oriented development, while important, often has a greater disadvantage for locals. And so food-oriented development, FOD, or EFOD, equitable food-oriented development, has a more economically robust approach and a more kind of equitable approach to engaging and supporting local communities and local resources. So this is kind of nearing my end of my talk. I want to say that we have a proposal for a building in balance initiative, both building in balance, but building it in. So how could we have more of a sustainability scorecard that could track not only environmental, social, and economic impacts, but also equity, that we can kind of look at what are we gaining and what are we losing as we gain a new 5-story building on a site on Hawthorne that happens to house 40 neighborhood serving businesses and is replaced with 3 retail commercial spaces. We've lost something. We may be gaining housing, but we've lost the neighborhood serving businesses that make us a walkable community. So these kinds of trade-offs, we need to be thinking about jobs, housing balance, and what are the needs that we have. We may be losing a historic building, but we're gaining a daycare or a grocery center, a grocery store. And so how can we be looking at these in a more less emotional way, that we're not attached to things, but we can look at it more in a quantifiable way that allows us to look at the many different goods and services that we're in, decisions that we need to weigh. And we really need more design services to support communities. And that's why we scaled up to a citywide effort as PDX Main Streets to help more communities that don't have architects and planners to help them. So we've worked in the communities near where we started, but we are reaching out across the city, and we invite you to join and participate and reach out to us. We also have been building a toolkit for neighborhood design, but we would like to more fully build that out with a train the trainers program and a curriculum that adds to the city's ABCs of land use, with a D for design, demolition, displacement, and also the E for equity. And to be able to create that kind of curriculum that really helps people where they're at. I will tell you that our former land use chair quit after she went to the city's training because it was so complicated and didn't help them understand how to participate. So we really need to, raise that design literacy and also be thinking about how can we support communities with more climate resilience and understanding of how the decisions we're making really contribute to affordability, because we've made it a more energy efficient building that's going to translate to monthly cost savings of their rent? Or are we stacking our floor plates and not cantilevering our buildings with expensive structural steel? Are we doing the things that are sort of good farmers logic architecture and building that contribute to affordability, that then leaves a little more room for that joy factor? This is what Walsh Construction talks about in their cost efficiency for affordability white paper, that leaves that extra bit for a little bit more art, a little bit more joy, that makes our buildings more human and livable. And how do we leverage that balance between our smaller, narrow main streets that have small lots but big impacts when we develop, and the land is more costly and it's already well resourced, versus the areas that aren't well resourced? The land is cheaper, the lots are bigger, and the streets are wider. How do we kind of work with both of those to make our civic corridors really the great dynamic places they could be, with density as a catalyst and even more modern architecture to have greater placemaking? And when I was a government planner in Santa Barbara, we had something called the Innovative Building Review Committee. And we had these innovation incentives where if you met them, you could work with your volunteer architects, planners, designers, landscape architects to advise and make those buildings really deep green. And I'd love to see some incentives for more. And now the incentives live with Prosper Portland. They're not at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. But if we had more of those incentives to be able to leverage and incentivize people to build in the places they're not building, to be that catalyst, it could be an interesting opportunity. So we'd love to talk about how we revisit our centers and corridor strategy. And we've proposed a leadership forum on Main Streets, centers, and corridors. And I know that the AIA fellows have this call out for greater grassroots visioning and a new look at our city. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to come together and talk about what is the need for communities, but also what is the challenge. Why is there this disconnect around growth and change? And I think a significant part of it is we haven't really laid the groundwork for people to understand how to make good density that lasts, how to turn them onto it through design, and empower them with the language to participate in the process and understand where they can have an influence and where they can't. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about these things. You know, when I was I helped start the Green Futures Research and Design Lab at the University of Washington. We did 100-year planning for green infrastructure. And I think there's a real opportunity, particularly like around one of my other clients is Levy Ready Columbia, is, you know, how could we be thinking about our community that gets people out of what about my property? How do we think about things in a grander vision that allows us to really come together and to work in a more collaborative manner across disciplines, across neighborhoods, and at all different stakeholder levels to collaborate for this common vision. So I want to thank you for engaging and hearing a little bit about our work. That's all I have for today.
Great. Thank you, Heather. I'm going to read some of the questions we've had, and I'm going to shorten them up because it looks like there's been a dialogue back and forth between people. But the first one is, the city of Portland used to fund neighborhood plans and have adopted them into the comprehensive plan. How can neighborhoods help restore these and something similar to the community led design guidelines?
Boy, that's a great question. Got me. I mean, I would turn it back to our, to folks like Brian, who've been, planners in Portland for a long time. I think that is a significant gap that we haven't really done that work. And that's partly, I think, a contributor of why there's this tension, that there, we are not able to rapidly respond to a significant volume of redevelopment. And there is not a process right now for being able to say, wow, we have, 6 buildings being built at the same time. What is the cumulative impact of that? And how do we engage the community about that massive redevelopment that's happening right now? So I don't have an answer for you how to bring that back, but I think that that's an important conversation and an important advocacy that could be happening with City Council. I'm curious if others have some thoughts on that particular question, because I would be interested in hearing from others that have been involved in this longer than I.
Yeah, just a follow up to that. Another question was, who administers these and under what authority?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Follow up question was, who administers these and under what authority?
The design guidelines or neighborhood plans?
Dawn, you asked the question. Well, probably both. Yeah.
So design guidelines are voluntary. Without an opportunity to have them embedded in our neighborhood district design plans, our design standards and guidelines, then they have no teeth. So we can use those guidelines as a tool for neighborhoods and business associations, for developers, architects. If you're a designer and you have a client that's maybe not so great or progressive, you can say, oh, here's some, language of what the community's priorities are. So right now it's all community driven, but we would really love to have that, have a pathway, like a community-led planning process or a community-led planning policy that would allow, if you met a certain set of best practices, and you could demonstrate widespread community support, that you had a real pathway to be recognized. And that's a gap that we have right now.
Great. Here's a great question. How do you prevent community-led process from being dominated by NIMBYism and constructionists, especially considering these views are often shared by the people that have the most time and resources to engage the public process?
Well, first of all, I don't really like the word NIMBY because I feel like it creates a divide between, sort of us and them kind of approaches. And I think that that's part of the problem that we have right now, is that we're putting people into taking sides. And what I've heard is that most of the time when people critique design, they're being labeled as anti-density or NIMBYs or anti-change. And I think we need to stop personalizing those issues right away, and stop using those labels. It's not helpful at all. It's not helpful for us to come together. But if you are feeling like that's really at the root of what's going on, I would say try to have a process where you can be able to hear what everyone's values are and actually document it, have a workshop. Because I think what we found through all of our processes and all the workshops is that people are actually much more aligned than you would think. And it's the sort of, spectrum of, how much density, because what I've seen in our process is that people are actually supportive of retaining our urban growth boundary. They support urban infill, they support density, but their biggest critique is design. And I'm not talking about style, but I'm talking about building form, operations, materials, context, livability, so many aspects that I think often get perceived as a NIMBYism approach. So I don't want to negate what you're asking about, but I think that a process where you can not sort of go with labeling and blame and shame, or really try to use the tools to have a dialogue that allows people to disagree without being disagreeable is really, really important. And I think we need more tools coming from civic life and others to help us navigate those and understand what it means when people say density and what it means when people talk about design.
Well, speaking of tools, that's our next question. Do your design tools have insights on bridging the gap between professional design expertise and grassroots popular understanding the design?
I think so. I mean, we have a 10-page glossary at the back of our design guidelines that were taken from city documents. And we also, use things like graphics to be able to help tell the story. So that if you don't have the words to describe it, you can point to a picture or you can point to a diagram. And so I think that really is an empowering way for a more productive and proactive, positive conversation with designers and developers to connect with community members. But early in the process is really key. And so we also have a community engagement policy that actually encourages developers to come early and to bring context elevations and site plans where you can see the adjacent lots and you really have enough information to be able to understand what the impacts are. So tools like that can also help.
Right, thank you. How do we get new mixed-use buildings to help pay for nearby public plazas? Currently, we have increased density, reduced parking, and very little green space. And a follow-up question about charging for parking. So many questions there.
Okay, let me try to just tackle the first one. So,
Right.
so just for community gathering spaces, we would love to have a plaza on Division. We had something previously considered by staff that was going to have an incentives approach for, I think it was green roofs, plazas, affordable housing, affordable retail, and green certifications. And I think the analysis from Echo Northwest showed that that the predominance would be to do everything but affordable housing for all of those other incentives. And so then the city decided, well, okay, we'll only do affordable housing as bonuses. But unfortunately, that was before the inclusionary zoning policies were enacted. And that study has not been done, has not been revisited. And I think that would be a really important one to advocate for, that the city look at that study again, because communities, I think, would be more supportive of additional density if they saw that there was something that was coming back, that was something for everyone. How is that development serving the whole community? and giving back. So that would be one way to sort of get maybe some of those resources to be built, maybe some offsetting of some park fees, if you're sort of calling that, sort of urban gathering spaces. I'm not sure about the pay for parking one. We've tried to stay away from parking pretty much the whole time. But I do think parking programs are a reasonable approach to be able to fund some of the things that are hard to fund right now, like a business district. For example, like Hawthorne could do an enhanced service district, could have parking structures, could have parking meters, but some of those resources could help pay for benches and trash cans and lighting and plazas and wayfinding. So I think we need to be able to build that toolbox for communities to be able to know how to access other financing tools and other policy tools.
Okay, thanks. Do you think that a post-COVID reduction in demand for downtown office space could create an opportunity for more mixing of uses downtown, i.e. Increase diversity of housing to better balance the office and so on? And then, so I'll just let you answer that one. It's a long question.
I would say, why not? This is, again, anything seems should be on the table right now. We have a significant amount of parking already downtown that is empty at night. And so, one of the opportunities about conjunctive use or shared use parking is that, let's say you have an office that's used or from 9 to 5 every day, and they need that parking for clients to come. And then you have your housing that's really only maybe using that in the off hours. And so that's a nice pairing of those. So it would make sense to have more of housing balanced with the office space downtown. And I think there might be more people looking to convert. So how do we design our buildings so that they maybe are convertible for multiple uses? And how do we have opportunities to convert what we already have?
Yeah, then there's a follow-up, a lot of dialogue between our people in the chat room about incorporating them into the design guidelines.
Are you talking about DOZA or?
Excuse me?
Are you talking about DOZA?
No, they're just follow-up, including them in the guidelines or neighborhood guidelines and Main Street. So it's just, if anyone wanted to go to the chat feature, everyone seems to be answering everyone's questions, which is pretty good. But I'm just going to try to continue on with Heather. Neighborhood plans should be considered by planners in transportation and BDS when they were considering added density and bikeway routes. Conditional uses and legislative reviews require applicants integrated these into, well, I guess that's a statement, integrated these plans into responses. So I think people were just asking just more follow-up to their questions in the chat room. I skipped over to you. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
We don't really have a pathway right now for community-led work to be cited. So city staff won't tell community members or tell developers or designers that the guidelines exist. So I know you're talking about specifically about neighborhood plans, but some of those neighborhood plans actually have design guidelines in them, like Sunnysides. So I don't think it's actually doing a developer or designer a service by not telling them. And the city staff actually had something previously in the recommendations to have community guidance sources, and that was taken out. So that's something to advocate for. Thank you, Catherine, for your advocacy to run for city council. And no, we're not getting paid. This has been, let's say 95% all volunteer. And just for reference, to give you some context on the value of the services that we have been doing for the city. Really, our intent is to give the city a gift of this work. Hasn't always felt that way, but I would say, for context, Chinatown's design guidelines cost $175,000. And we've basically done all this work over 5 years, for free. And then we, did a low bono work for our Selwood Moreland's design guidelines. So Joanne Hardesty was the first city staff person, I would say, or city person who had said thank you. And besides Amanda Fritz, who, thanked us for our work. I don't know why that's not valued. And it's concerning that, Albina Vision is doing a wonderful job and there is no pathway for them. So there's a real problem when, we're not allowing community work to support and help, fill in the gaps. I would be curious to hear from the urban design panel, how they could, how communities can support the city in an effective way.
So I'm just going to have one more question because we're getting back to 1 o'clock. And the last one, it's a good question. What can be done to bring the design language into everyday activities along the main street? Placemaking, signage, tours, maybe public art focusing on language and pattern design, patterns of design.
Yeah, I think, just teaching people the pattern language. The city has pattern areas, but I think you need maybe a more distinct pattern area for main streets. And describing that, I think having Main Street standards would help. There's just, it's like our mini downtown. And so I think we're happy to take people on a design walk anytime. I think that's a great way to teach people what I've heard. I think Linda Netakoven was talked about. It's like putting on a pair of glasses. We take a community on a design walk and they instantly see their city in an entirely different way. They see, the articulated roof lines. They see the base, middle, top, the vertical punched windows, and the regular rhythm of recessed entries, the clear story windows, the large emphasized entrances of all the old multifamily buildings. And they see rounded edges, and they see, arches and towers. And these features are all throughout our city. But if you don't have the language to know what it is or know how to ask for it, in a new modern building that could pick up on those patterns, that community would say, well, we like that building because it relates, but doesn't replicate. And I think there's an important kind of nuance. So I think, what we can do is stop talking about NIMBYs and talking about YIMBYs. I really think that it's so unproductive and it's false. It's a false narrative. But we need to refine and nuance the conversation about density. What does good density look like? How do you build it in an affordable way? How do you build it so it demonstrates quality? And what are those features that aren't just fashion for fashion, but they actually provide a certain function? Those raised sills, that's not a fashion. That's actually, so that you have storage underneath the storefront windows and that you're not looking up someone's skirt if they're sitting at a restaurant. Those recessed entries that actually provide a place to step out of the rain or be able to let a passerby go through. Those, sort of horizontal bands that make a building feel smaller, or a step back that allows that density, but it doesn't necessarily have to feel that way at the street. So all of these tricks of design, it's not about style, but about form and pattern. And that's part of what we're trying to teach. And that helps communities get on board with density. So if we really want to support density, if you really want communities to go there, design is the critical ingredient. And I hope that people will, that maybe the urban design panel could support some tools for main streets, because if we want to also further our economic vitality with more people working at home, more people are going to be needing those small urban centers to really stay vibrant. And they're struggling right now, and they're fragile. And they're an important part of our culture and legacy there too. So I would ask and advocate for the urban design panel to come out and support some Main Street standards in DOZA and a comparable design threshold for similar to downtown for parity. That would mean a lot to, I think, communities, and would help us kind of do it better as we go forward to sort of grow with care. would make communities also feel really heard. So that's my advocacy, but I would love to participate and join if there's an opportunity to collaborate with the Urban Design Panel on putting together this leadership forum and kind of look at how are we doing on our centers and corridors strategy. How's that working? What are we missing? What do we need? And how do we leverage our civic corridors to be maybe a heavy lifter to build in the places that really need it and catalyze that new development?
Well, I think, it's almost, it's a little after 1 right now, so I think we can let people go. But I think, Heather, you've put up a good challenge there for everybody on this call to actually figure out, okay, so I kind of get what's going on here with your pitch, so to speak. And I think it makes a lot of sense for the executive committee of the Urban Design Panel to really have a conversation about this, and we will meet next Wednesday. And having some sort of a leadership forum, I think, could really push this along. And who knows what shape that's going to take, or what that looks like. But I think we really thank you for your presentation. It's very thoughtful, and I think it was quite germane to the point that we've been working on lately, which is how do we do design in order to really foster the resiliency in our communities that we need to meet the climate challenge and all the other challenges we face.
Yeah, what are the other tools in our toolbox? And we have a proposal for a leadership forum already, so we'd love to talk with you more about that. And would welcome that be shaped by leadership from the Urban Design Panel.
We'll be talking.
Great to see everyone, and thank you so much for being here.
Good to see you guys.
Heather, I encourage you to be as involved as you can in what we're in our events as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it and look forward to learning more from all of you too. Please feel free to get in touch.
Hi, Steve Lojas. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.